In 73 BC, 70 starving men seized kitchen knives and changed the course of history. They were slaves. They were gladiators. They were the walking dead, trained to kill each other for Roman entertainment. But on one blood-soaked morning in Capua, they refused to die on schedule. They fought their way through armed guards, stole weapons from passing wagons, and vanished into the Italian countryside. Rome laughed. A handful of escaped slaves. The legions would crush them within weeks. But Rome was wrong, catastrophically wrong. Within months, those 70 men became 70,000. Within 2 years, they would become 120,000. For nearly 2 years, they would defeat every army Rome sent against them, until one ruthless general changed everything. They would make senators tremble and consuls flee, and at their head stood one man, a Thracian warrior whose name would echo through eternity. His name was Spartacus, and this is the true story of Rome's greatest nightmare. Before we dive into this epic tale of rebellion and blood, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. This channel brings you the brutal truth of history's greatest conflicts, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next in this story. Now, let's begin. The year is 73 BC. The Roman Republic stands as the most dominant military power the ancient world has ever known. Its legions have crushed kingdoms, toppled empires, and enslaved millions. From the shores of Hispania to the mountains of Asia Minor, Rome's iron grip seems unbreakable. Senators grow fat on conquered wealth. Patrician families build palatial estates worked by armies of slaves. The Republic has become an insatiable machine, and its fuel is human bondage. For every Roman citizen living in comfort, there are several slaves living in chains. They work the mines until their lungs turn black. They till the fields until their backs break. And in the gladiatorial schools, the infamous ludi, they are transformed into instruments of death, trained to slaughter each other for the amusement of crowds. But something was stirring in the shadows. Decades earlier, Sicily had erupted in slave revolts, the First and Second Servile Wars, where hundreds of thousands of slaves rose up against their masters. Rome had crushed these rebellions with extreme brutality, crucifying thousands as a warning. But the lesson the Romans took from these wars was dangerously wrong. They believed slaves were too broken, too divided, too ignorant to ever pose a real threat. They were cattle to be managed, not enemies to be feared. This arrogance would cost them dearly, because in a gladiator school in the city of Capua, just over 100 miles south of Rome itself, a storm was gathering. The man at its centre was a Thracian by birth, possibly from the Mede tribe that dwelt on the wild frontiers of the Roman world. Some ancient sources say Spartacus had once served as an auxiliary soldier in the Roman legions before being condemned to slavery for desertion. Others claim he was a captive taken during Rome's endless frontier wars. What we know for certain is this: he was sold to a man named Lentulus Betiatus, the owner of one of the most notorious gladiatorial schools in Italy. He was trained as a murmiglio, a heavyweight gladiator who fought with a large rectangular shield called a scutum and a short, brutal sword called a gladius, the same weapons carried by Roman legionaries. Spartacus was being forged into a killer, but the Romans had made a fatal miscalculation. They'd given a warrior the skills to destroy them. To understand what happened next, you must first understand what a Roman gladiator school truly was. Forget the romanticized images from Hollywood. The Ludus was a prison. The Ludus was a death camp. The gladiators who lived there were not celebrities. They were property. They were slaves condemned to the arena, prisoners of war, criminals sentenced to die. Under Roman law, a slave was not a person. A slave was a thing. Owners could beat their slaves, torture their slaves, even kill their slaves without facing any legal consequence. And nowhere was this dehumanization more complete than in the gladiatorial schools. The Ludus of Lentulus Batiatus in Capua was legendary for its brutality. The gladiators lived in cramped cells, locked behind iron bars like animals in a cage. They were fed a diet heavy in barley and beans, slave food considered beneath Roman citizens, but designed to pack muscle onto their frames. Every day they trained under the watchful eyes of doctors, retired gladiators who drilled them in the art of killing. They practiced against wooden posts called pallus, driving their swords into the wood until their arms screamed. They sparred against each other with weighted wooden weapons, building the stamina they would need to survive in the arena. But make no mistake, the arena was where most of them would die. Gladiatorial combat was not fake. It was not theatre. When two gladiators faced each other on the sand, one of them often did not walk away. The survivors became valuable property, but they remained slaves nonetheless. They were rented out for entertainment, sent to fight in games across Italy, and their winnings went directly into their masters' pockets. Batiatus, the ancient sources tell us, was particularly harsh. His school was known for its discipline, its security, and its cruelty. Most of his gladiators were Thracians and Gauls, men from warrior cultures who had been captured, enslaved, and stripped of everything except their will to survive. Inside the walls of Batiatus's Ludus, something dangerous was happening. The gladiators were talking, whispering in the darkness of their cells, plotting in the mess hall as they choked down their barley porridge. They were done being slaves. They were done dying for Roman entertainment. They were going to fight their way to freedom or die trying. The ancient historian Plutarch tells us that approximately 200 gladiators were involved in the original conspiracy. 200 men who had decided that death in a desperate escape attempt was preferable to life in chains. At the centre of this conspiracy stood 3 men. Spartacus, the Thracian, was joined by 2 Gallic slaves named Crixus and Oenomaus. These were not ordinary men. They were warriors who had once led their own people in battle before being captured and sold into slavery. They knew how to fight, they knew how to lead, and they knew that if they were going to escape, they would need more than courage. They would need weapons. The gladiators hatched their plan carefully. They would seize whatever they could find, fight their way through the guards, and escape into the countryside before anyone could stop them. But conspiracies involving 200 men are almost impossible to keep secret. Someone talked. The plot was betrayed to Batiatus, and the window for escape began to close. When word of the betrayal reached Spartacus and his fellow conspirators, they faced a terrible choice. They could abandon the plan and face whatever punishment their masters would devise, or they could strike immediately with whatever they had before it was too late. They chose to fight. The breakout began in the mess hall. It was 73 BC, and approximately 70 gladiators, the core of the conspiracy who had not yet been arrested, seized their moment. The ancient sources are vivid in their descriptions. The gladiators grabbed kitchen implements, choppers, meat cleavers, iron spits used for roasting. These were not weapons, they were tools of butchery. But in the hands of men trained to kill, they became instruments of death. The guards never stood a chance. These gladiators had spent years perfecting the art of close-quarters combat. They knew how to kill quickly and efficiently. They knew how to work together, covering each other's flanks, coordinating their attacks. The mess hall became a slaughterhouse. Guards fell screaming as cleavers split their skulls and spits punched through their throats. Within minutes, the 70 gladiators had fought their way to the gates. They burst out of the Ludus and into the streets of Capua, covered in blood and desperate for freedom. But they were not finished. As they fled through the city, they encountered wagons loaded with gladiatorial weapons and armour, equipment being transported for games elsewhere in Italy. This was the stroke of luck that transformed a desperate escape into something far more dangerous. The gladiators seized the wagons, arming themselves with real weapons. Now they had swords, now they had shields, now they had armour, and now, instead of 70 escaped slaves armed with kitchen knives, Rome faced 70 trained killers equipped for war. The escaped gladiators fled south, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Capua. They knew that Roman forces would be sent to recapture them. They knew that if they were caught, they would face a death far worse than the arena. The punishment for slave rebellion was crucifixion, a slow, agonizing execution designed to send a message to every other slave in the Republic. But Spartacus was thinking strategically. He led his followers to Mount Vesuvius, the great volcanic mountain that dominated the landscape of Campania. The mountain offered everything the fugitives needed: defensible terrain, natural resources, and a position from which they could see any approaching army. As news of the breakout spread through the Italian countryside, something remarkable began to happen. Other slaves started to appear at Vesuvius, field workers who had spent their lives breaking their backs on Roman estates, shepherds and herdsmen who tended their masters' flocks on the hillsides, household slaves who had endured years of abuse and degradation. They came in ones and twos at first, then in dozens, then in hundreds. The ancient sources tell us that many of these slaves had served as soldiers before their enslavement, veterans of the recent social war who knew how to fight and how to follow orders. Spartacus welcomed them all. On Mount Vesuvius, he began organizing his growing band into something resembling an army. He established a command structure, appointed leaders, and began training those who had no combat experience. The escaped gladiators became his elite corps, his veterans who would lead the others into battle. Crixus and Oenomaus served as his co-commanders, each responsible for their own contingent of rebels. What had started as a prison break was transforming into something the Romans had never seen before: a slave army. When news of the escape reached Rome, the Senate barely raised an eyebrow. A few dozen escaped gladiators hiding on a mountain. This was a police matter, not a military crisis. The legions were busy with real threats: wars in Hispania, campaigns in Asia Minor. Rome would not waste valuable military resources on runaway slaves. Instead, the task was given to a praetor named Gaius Claudius Glaber. He was authorized to raise a militia force of approximately 3,000 men, not professional legionaries, but hastily conscripted troops with minimal training. The ancient historian Appian notes that the Romans did not even consider this a proper war, merely a raid, something like dealing with highway robbers. Glaber's strategy was simple and, in his mind, foolproof. He would march his militia to Mount Vesuvius and blockade the only known path leading up the mountain. Without food or water, the slaves would have two choices: surrender or starve. There would be no need for a costly assault. Glaber set up camp on the slopes of Vesuvius, blocking the main route down the mountain, and settled into wait. His men grew relaxed, complacent. Why worry? Their enemies were trapped with nowhere to go. But Glaber had made a catastrophic error. He had assumed that gladiators, slaves, would think like Romans. He had assumed they would see only the obstacles in front of them. He had assumed they would accept their fate. He did not understand that he was dealing with men who had already chosen death over slavery. Men who had nothing left to lose. Men who would do whatever it took to survive. Spartacus studied his enemy's position and found its weakness. Glubber had blocked the main path, but he had ignored the steep cliffs on the opposite side of the mountain. Why bother guarding them? Those cliffs were impossible to descend, or so the Romans believed. But Spartacus had spent his life defying impossible odds. He gathered his men and revealed his plan. They would not attack the Romans head-on. They would not try to force their way down the blocked path. Instead, they would do something the Romans would never expect. The slopes of Vesuvius were covered with wild grapevines, tough, fibrous plants that had survived on the volcanic soil for centuries. Spartacus ordered his men to harvest these vines. They wove them together, creating ropes and crude ladders strong enough to support a man's weight. Night after night, working in secret, the slaves constructed the equipment they would need for their escape. When everything was ready, Spartacus led his warriors to the cliff edge. Below them was a drop that would kill any man who lost his grip. Behind them was a Roman army waiting to crucify them. They climbed down anyway. One by one, the escaped gladiators lowered themselves down the sheer rock face, clinging to their vine ropes in the darkness. Some must have fallen. Some must have died. But enough of them made it to the base of the mountain, on the side opposite from Glaber's camp. The Romans had no idea what was happening. They slept peacefully, confident that their enemies were trapped and helpless. They were about to receive a brutal awakening. The slaves moved silently through the darkness, circling around the base of Vesuvius. They approached Glaber's camp from the rear, from the direction the Romans thought was completely secure. There were no sentries watching that approach. There were no fortifications protecting that flank. Glubber's confidence had left his army completely exposed. Spartacus gave the signal. The gladiators attacked. What followed was not a battle. It was a massacre. The Roman militia, caught completely off guard, scrambled from their tents to face an enemy that seemed to have materialized from nowhere. Many were cut down before they could even reach their weapons. The gladiators fought with savage precision, their years of arena training turning them into killing machines. They moved through the Roman camp like wolves through a flock of sheep, slashing and stabbing with brutal efficiency. Glaber's militia broke and ran. Those who escaped did so by sheer luck, fleeing into the darkness while their comrades died screaming. The sources are unclear about whether Glaber himself was killed in the attack or simply disappeared from history in disgrace. What is clear is that his army was utterly annihilated. The slaves seized everything the Romans had left behind: weapons, armor, food, supplies. What had been a desperate band of fugitives was now an armed force equipped with the Roman military gear, and their victory sent shockwaves throughout the Italian countryside. Word spread like wildfire through the slave quarters of every estate in Campania. The gladiators had defeated a Roman army. The slaves had won. It seemed impossible. It seemed like a miracle. For generations, slaves had been told they were nothing, property, cattle, less than human. They had been taught that resistance was futile, that Roman power was absolute, that their only purpose was to serve until they died. And now, on a mountainside in southern Italy, that lie had been exposed. Slaves began to flee their masters in droves. Field workers abandoned their ploughs. Household servants disappeared in the night. Miners emerged from their hellish tunnels and followed the rumours to Vesuvius. Every day, more refugees arrived at Spartacus's camp, desperate to join the rebellion. The ancient sources tell us that the rebel ranks swelled to include men from every corner of the Roman world. Thracians, Gauls, Germans, Greeks, Italians. They were united by a single, burning desire: freedom. Rome sent a second praetor, Publius Varinius, with additional forces to crush the rebellion. Varinius split his army into separate detachments under his lieutenants Furius and Cosinius. It was a fatal mistake. Spartacus's forces fell on these divided units with devastating effectiveness. Cosinius was killed in the fighting. Varinius himself barely escaped capture, abandoning his own horse and equipment in his flight. The slaves seized more Roman weapons, more Roman armour, more Roman supplies. With each victory they grew stronger. By the winter of 73-72 BC, Spartacus commanded an army unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. The estimates vary, but the sources suggest his forces had grown to approximately 70,000 fighters. These were not random mobs of desperate slaves. Spartacus was moulding them into something far more dangerous. He spent the winter months training his recruits, teaching them the basics of Roman military tactics, organising them into units that could fight as cohesive formations. The gladiators served as his officer corps, experienced fighters who could lead the new recruits into battle. The veterans from the social war provided crucial knowledge about how Roman legions operated, how they formed their battle lines, how they could be defeated. Spartacus enforced strict discipline. He established rules governing the distribution of plunder, ensuring that loot was shared equally among his followers. He knew that an army united by more than just desperation would be far harder to defeat. The rebels expanded their territory, raiding towns throughout southern Italy. They struck Nola, Nuceria, Thurii and Metapontum, gathering more supplies and more recruits with each attack. Merchants began secretly trading with the rebel army, exchanging plunder for bronze and iron that could be forged into weapons. What had started as 70 men with kitchen knives had become a force that could challenge the legions of Rome. And in the Senate the laughter had stopped. The jokes about escaped slaves had given way to genuine fear. The breakout from Capua had succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. 70 gladiators had escaped with kitchen implements. Now tens of thousands of armed slaves controlled large swathes of southern Italy. 2 Roman commanders had been humiliated, their forces destroyed or scattered. The Republic's reputation for invincibility had been shattered. Slaves throughout Italy watched and waited, wondering if this impossible rebellion might actually succeed. For Rome, the situation had become intolerable. The Third Servile War was no longer a local disturbance to be handled by militia. It was an existential threat that demanded the full attention of the Senate and the deployment of Rome's most powerful armies. But even as the Senate debated its response, Spartacus was already planning his next move. He knew that Rome's full might would eventually be turned against him. He knew that his army, despite its victories, was no match for the professional legions. But he also knew something else. He knew that every slave in Italy was watching. He knew that every victory inspired more people to join his cause. He knew that as long as he kept winning, his army would keep growing. The spark that had been lit in a mess hall in Capua had become a flame that threatened to consume the entire Roman Republic, and the true nightmare was only beginning. In Act 2, we will witness the impossible, a slave army defeating the legions of Rome time and time again until the Senate is forced to give command to the most ruthless man in the Republic. If you're enjoying this journey through one of history's most incredible rebellions, do me a favour. Drop a like on this video right now. It helps the channel more than you know, and it tells us you want more content like this. Now let's get back to the story, because things are about to get brutal. The year is 72 BC, and Rome can no longer ignore what is happening in the south. The defeat of Glaber and Varinius has sent shockwaves through the Republic. Senators who once laughed at reports of escaped gladiators now whisper nervously in the halls of the Curia. The slave army on Vesuvius has become something far more dangerous than anyone imagined. Intelligence reports paint a terrifying picture. The rebels number in the tens of thousands. They are organized, disciplined, and winning, and every day more slaves flee their masters to join them. The Senate makes a fateful decision. This is no longer a police action to be handled by praetors and militia. This is war. For the campaign season of 72 BC, Rome dispatches its most powerful military force, 2 full consular armies under the command of the consuls themselves, Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, each command 2 legions of professional soldiers. These are not hastily conscripted militia like Glaber's force. These are trained legionaries, equipped with the finest weapons and armour, led by experienced officers, 8,000 men per consul, 16,000 soldiers in total. Against an army of slaves, this should be overwhelming force. The consuls develop a coordinated strategy. They will hunt down the rebels, pin them between their 2 armies, and crush them. By summer, the Senate expects victory. By autumn, they expect to see crucified slaves lining every road in southern Italy. The consuls march south with absolute confidence, but Spartacus was not waiting passively for destruction. During the winter months he'd been busy. His army had swelled with new recruits, field slaves, household servants, shepherds, mine workers. Many were veterans of previous wars who knew how to fight. Spartacus organized them into units, appointed officers, and drilled them relentlessly. The gladiators served as his elite corps, the backbone around which the larger army was built. By spring, he commanded a force that ancient sources estimate at 70,000 or more. But this massive army faced a strategic dilemma. Where should they go? What was their ultimate goal? The sources suggest a fundamental disagreement within the rebel command structure. Spartacus, according to Plutarch, wanted to march north toward the Alps. His plan was to cross the mountains and allow his followers to disperse to their homelands, Thrace, Gaul, Germania. Freedom, not conquest, was his objective. He understood that no slave army, however large, could ultimately defeat the full might of Rome. Crixus, the Gallic commander who had escaped alongside Spartacus, had different ideas. He and his followers wanted to stay in Italy. They wanted to raid, to plunder, to take vengeance on the Romans who had enslaved them. Some historians suggest Crixus even dreamed of marching on Rome itself. Whatever the reason, the rebel army split. Crixus led approximately 30,000 Gauls and Germans away from the main force. It was a decision that would prove fatal. The consul Gellius received intelligence about the split and saw his opportunity. He moved quickly, catching Crixus and his contingent near Mount Gargano in Apulia. The terrain favoured the Romans, rolling hills where their disciplined formations could operate effectively. Crixus, perhaps overconfident from earlier victories against militia, chose to attack. It was a catastrophic mistake. The Roman legions deployed defensively along the crest of a hill, shields locked, javelins ready. Crixus led his rebels in assault after assault up the steep slopes. 3 times the slaves charged. 3 times they were thrown back with horrific casualties. The Roman pilum, the heavy javelin designed to punch through shields and armour, wreaked havoc on the attacking rebels. 2/3 of Crixus's army fell on the bloody hillside, and among the dead was Crixus himself, killed fighting bravely in a losing cause. It was the first major defeat for the slave rebellion. Gellius was triumphant. He had destroyed 30,000 rebels and killed one of their commanders. Surely now the back of the rebellion was broken. He sent messengers racing to Rome with news of victory. Then he turned north, pursuing the main rebel force under Spartacus. Meanwhile, his colleague Lentulus positioned his army to block Spartacus's path toward the Alps. The trap was set. 2 consular armies would catch the slaves between them and finish what Gellius had started at Gargano. What happened next stunned Rome to its core. Spartacus received word of Crixus's death and the destruction of his army, but instead of despair he channeled his grief into cold, calculated fury. According to Appian, Spartacus forced 300 captured Roman soldiers to fight each other to the death as gladiators, a brutal reversal of the arena where slaves had once died for Roman entertainment. Now Romans died to honour a fallen slave. It was a message Rome would never forget. Then Spartacus moved. He did not flee, he attacked. Splitting his own force, he left a smaller contingent to hold Gellius in check, while he hurled his main army against Lentulus. The consul had positioned himself to block the rebels' northern advance, confident that his legions would hold until Gellius could strike from behind. He was wrong. Spartacus hit Lentulus's army like a thunderbolt. The slave forces showed tactical sophistication that shocked Roman officers. Spartacus had built a cavalry force during the preceding months. Thracians were renowned horsemen, capable of taming even wild horses. These mounted warriors screened his movements and struck at Roman flanks. The legions of Lentulus were mauled. The consul's forces scattered, abandoning their supplies and equipment. Spartacus seized everything: weapons, armour, food, the military standards themselves. Then he turned and smashed Gellius's army, which had advanced expecting to find fleeing slaves, not a victorious army ready for another fight. 2 consular armies, 16,000 professional soldiers, had been defeated. The consuls themselves barely escaped with their lives. When news reached Rome, it created panic unlike anything the Republic had experienced in generations. This was not some frontier skirmish. This was happening in Italy itself, just days' march from the capital. The slave army was advancing north, growing stronger with every victory, and nothing seemed capable of stopping it. Spartacus pushed his followers forward with relentless speed. The ancient sources tell us he burned unnecessary equipment, killed prisoners who would slow the march, and slaughtered pack animals to feed his army on the move. His objective was clear: reach the Alps before Rome could regroup, cross the mountains, scatter to freedom. His army marched through central Italy, defeating every force sent against them. Near Mutina, they encountered Gaius Cassius Longinus, the governor of Cisalpine Gaul, with 10,000 men. Cassius was destroyed. His army was routed, and the governor himself barely escaped with his life. The path to the Alps lay open. Freedom was within reach. Spartacus had done the impossible. He had fought his way through the entire Italian peninsula, defeating every Roman force in his path. His army stood at the threshold of the mountains. Beyond those peaks lay Gaul, Thrace, Germania, homelands where Rome's power could not reach them. And then, inexplicably, Spartacus turned back. At the very moment of potential escape, the slave army wheeled around and marched south again. It remains one of history's great mysteries. Why did Spartacus abandon his plan? Why did he lead his followers back into the heart of Roman power? The ancient sources offer several possibilities. Plutarch suggests that Spartacus's men refused to leave Italy. They had grown confident from their victories and wanted to continue raiding and plundering. Others speculate that crossing the Alps with such a massive force, women, children, and non-combatants had joined the army, would have been logistically impossible. Winter was approaching, and the mountain passes would soon become death traps. Some modern historians suggest Spartacus may have had grander ambitions that the sources do not record. Perhaps he believed he could actually challenge Rome itself. Whatever the reason, the decision sealed the rebellion's fate. Rome would not make the same mistakes twice. While Spartacus marched south, spending the remainder of 72 BC raiding through Italy, the Senate was preparing its response. They had learned that praetors and consuls were not enough. They needed someone ruthless, someone wealthy, someone willing to do whatever it took to crush the rebellion. They found him in Marcus Licinius Crassus. Marcus Licinius Crassus was perhaps the wealthiest individual in Roman history. His fortune was legendary, estimated at approximately 200 million sesterces, an almost incomprehensible sum. He had built this wealth through methods that revealed his character perfectly. During the civil wars between Sulla and the Marian faction, Crassus had fought on Sulla's winning side. When Sulla instituted proscriptions, death lists that allowed the seizure of enemies' property, Crassus became one of the greatest beneficiaries. He bought confiscated estates at pennies on the denarius. He purchased slaves who were architects and builders. When fires broke out in Rome's crowded neighbourhoods, a near-daily occurrence, Crassus's private fire brigade would rush to the scene. But they would not extinguish the flames until Crassus had purchased the burning building and its neighbours at rock-bottom prices from desperate owners. If owners refused to sell, his men simply watched the structures burn to the ground. This was the man Rome turned to in its hour of need. Crassus was not just wealthy, he was ambitious. He had fought at the Battle of the Colline Gate, commanding the victorious right wing of Sulla's army. He craved military glory to match his financial success. But his rival Pompey the Great consistently overshadowed him. The command against Spartacus offered Crassus an opportunity to prove himself as a military leader. He offered to equip, train, and lead new legions at his own expense. The Senate accepted. Crassus took command of the shattered consular armies and added 6 newly raised legions. A total force of approximately 40,000 men. He would need every soldier. But first, he had to address a critical problem. The troops who had fought under Gellius and Lentulus were demoralized and terrified. They had seen Roman armies destroyed by slaves. They had fled from men they were supposed to consider subhuman. Crassus would not tolerate cowardice. When a detachment of his army under his legate Mummius disobeyed orders and attacked Spartacus prematurely and was routed for their trouble, Crassus revived an ancient and terrible punishment: decimation. 1 in every 10 men from the disgraced units would die. The soldiers were divided into groups of 10. Each group drew lots. The man who drew the marked lot was beaten to death by his 9 companions. If anyone refused to participate, they would join the condemned. Approximately 50 men died that day, clubbed to death by their own comrades while the entire army watched. Plutarch reports that many things, horrible and dreadful to see, occurred during the punishment. The message was unmistakable. Crassus was more dangerous to cowards than Spartacus was to brave men. The army's discipline transformed overnight. From that moment forward, Crassus's legions would fight with desperate ferocity, not just against the slaves, but to avoid their own commander's wrath. The campaign of 71 BC became a grinding war of attrition. Crassus understood that he could not simply chase Spartacus across Italy. The slave leader was too skilled at maneuver, too adept at choosing favourable ground. Instead, Crassus would use Rome's greatest advantage: resources. He had money to pay his troops, supply lines to feed them, and reinforcements to replace his losses. Spartacus had none of these advantages. Every battle cost him men he could not replace. Crassus pushed Spartacus south, fighting a series of engagements that gradually wore down the rebel forces. Thousands of slaves fell in these battles. Spartacus won some encounters, but he could no longer deliver the crushing victories of the previous year. His army was bleeding. Morale was declining. The rebellion began to fracture again as various groups broke away, seeking their own paths to survival. Crassus's legions caught these splinter groups and annihilated them one by one. By late 71 BC, Spartacus found himself pushed into the toe of Italy, the Bruttium Peninsula, modern Calabria. He was running out of room to maneuver. According to Plutarch, Spartacus made contact with Cilician pirates, bargaining for ships to transport 2,000 of his men to Sicily. He planned to ignite another slave revolt on the island, where the First and Second Servile Wars had erupted decades earlier, but the pirates took his money and never returned. Spartacus was trapped. Crassus moved to seal Spartacus's fate. He ordered his legions to construct one of the most ambitious military engineering projects in Roman history, a wall and ditch stretching across the entire width of the Bruttium Peninsula from sea to sea. The fortification ran approximately 40 miles, featuring a ditch 15 feet wide and equally deep, backed by a massive rampart. In a matter of weeks, Crassus's army transformed the geography of southern Italy. Behind this wall, Spartacus's army began to starve. The rebels were cut off from the rest of Italy, unable to raid for supplies, unable to receive reinforcements. Winter set in, adding freezing temperatures to hunger. It seemed the rebellion would end not with a battle but with slow strangulation. Crassus could afford to wait. Every day that passed weakened his enemies further. Victory was simply a matter of patience. But Spartacus refused to die quietly. On a night of heavy snowfall, when visibility was near zero and Crassus's sentries huddled against the cold, the slaves made their move. They filled a section of the massive ditch with earth, tree branches, and the bodies of slaughtered animals. They built a bridge across the Roman fortifications. Then, in the howling darkness of the storm, Spartacus led his army across the wall and broke free. Even trapped, even starving, the Gladiator had found a way to escape. The escape from Bruttium was Spartacus's last great victory, but it changed nothing fundamental. Crassus still had his army. Rome still had its resources, and now other forces were converging on Italy. Pompey the Great was marching from Hispania, where he had crushed the rebellion of Sertorius. Marcus Terentius Varro Lucullus was sailing from Thrace with additional legions. The Senate had summoned every available commander to crush Spartacus once and for all. Crassus understood the political implications. If Pompey or Lucullus arrived, before the rebellion was finished, they would claim credit for the victory. Everything Crassus had worked for, the military glory that would boost his political career, would be stolen by rivals. He drove his legions forward with renewed fury, determined to end the war before reinforcements arrived. Spartacus, meanwhile, attempted to negotiate. He sent envoys to Crassus, seeking terms that might allow at least some of his followers to survive. Crassus refused. There would be no negotiation with slaves. There would be no surrender accepted. This rebellion would end only one way, with the complete annihilation of everyone who had dared to raise arms against Rome. Spartacus understood. He had always understood. From the moment he seized that kitchen knife in the mess hall at Capua, he had known that this road led only to victory or death, and victory was no longer possible. The rebellion's final chapter began when the slave army fractured one last time. A contingent of Gauls and Germans under commanders named Gannicus and Castus separated from Spartacus's main force. Perhaps they hoped to find their own escape route. Perhaps internal disputes had made unified command impossible. Whatever the reason, Crassus pounced. His legions caught the splinter force separated from Spartacus and destroyed it utterly. 12,300 slaves died in the engagement. Spartacus tried to rescue his allies. He reversed his march and moved toward Crassus's position. But every attempt to break through was repulsed. The rebels who died under Gannicus and Castus were men Spartacus could not afford to lose. His army was shrinking with every engagement. The survivors were exhausted, hungry, and increasingly desperate. They had been fighting and running for nearly 2 years, and now the walls were closing in from every direction. Word reached Spartacus that Pompey's legions were approaching from the north. Soon he would face not one Roman army but several. His options had narrowed to a single choice. He could continue running, watching his army disintegrate piece by piece, hunted like an animal until the end. Or he could turn and fight one final battle, stake everything on one desperate gamble. Spartacus chose to fight. He would meet Crassus on the field and decide the fate of the rebellion with sword and blood. We've reached the final chapter of this incredible story. If you've made it this far, you're clearly a true history enthusiast. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss another episode of Wars in History. Share this video with someone who loves ancient history. They'll thank you for it. Now, let's witness the brutal end of Spartacus and the most horrifying aftermath in Roman history. The year is 71 BC, and the endgame is approaching. Spartacus has broken free from Crassus's wall across Bruttium, but his situation has not improved. The slave army that once numbered over 100,000 has been bled by months of attrition warfare. Thousands have fallen in skirmishes. Thousands more have melted away into the Italian countryside, seeking their own paths to survival. The rebellion that once seemed unstoppable is now fighting for its very existence, and the wolves are closing in from every direction. Pompey the Great is marching from Hispania with battle-hardened legions fresh from crushing the Sertorian rebellion. Marcus Terentius Varro Lucullus is sailing from Thrace with additional forces. Crassus commands over 40,000 professional soldiers and controls the ground between Spartacus and any possible escape route. The mathematics of the situation are brutal and inescapable. Even if Spartacus wins another battle, there will always be another Roman army behind it. The slave leader understood what was coming. According to the ancient sources, he attempted one final gambit: negotiation. Spartacus sent envoys to Crassus, seeking terms that might spare at least some of his followers. Perhaps he hoped for exile. Perhaps he sought guarantees for the women and children who had joined his army. Whatever he proposed, Crassus refused absolutely. There would be no mercy for rebellious slaves. There would only be annihilation. As hope dwindled, the rebel army fractured one final time. A contingent of Gauls and Germans under the commanders Gannicus and Castus separated from Spartacus's main force. The reasons remain unclear. Perhaps strategic disagreement, perhaps desperation driving men to seek their own salvation. Whatever their motivation, it proved fatal. Crassus detected the split and moved immediately to exploit it. His legions caught Gannicus and Castus in a devastating engagement. The isolated rebel force was surrounded and annihilated. The ancient sources record that 12,300 slaves fell in this battle alone. Gannicus and Castus were among the dead. These were men Spartacus desperately needed. Experienced fighters who had survived 2 years of impossible warfare. Their loss gutted what remained of the rebellion's military strength. Spartacus attempted to rescue his allies. He reversed his march and moved toward Crassus's position, hoping to break through and reach the beleaguered contingent. But every attack was repulsed. The Roman legions, disciplined by decimation and driven by their general's relentless will, held firm. Spartacus could only watch as the last remnants of Gannicus's force were destroyed. The rebellion was hemorrhaging men it could never replace. Word reached Spartacus that Pompey's legions were closing from the north. The trap was complete. Behind him stood the sea he could not cross. Before him stood Crassus's army. Approaching from the north came Pompey's veterans. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide, no trick of terrain or brilliance of tactics that could save them now. The rebellion that had humiliated Rome for 2 years was cornered like a wounded animal. For Spartacus the choice was clear. He could continue to flee, watching his army disintegrate piece by piece as Crassus hunted down each fragment. He could surrender and face the crucifixion that awaited all rebellious slaves. Or he could turn and fight one final battle, stake everything on one desperate gamble that might, somehow, against all odds, break through Roman lines. The gladiator who had escaped from Capua with a kitchen knife chose the only option consistent with everything he had done. He would fight. He would lead his army into battle one last time, not for victory. That was no longer possible, not for escape. There was nowhere left to go. He would fight because that was who he was. He would fight because slaves were not supposed to fight back, and for 2 years he had proven that slaves could do the impossible. He would fight because death in battle was preferable to death on a cross. Before the final battle, Spartacus performed an act that the ancient historians recorded with something approaching reverence. He ordered his horse to be brought before the assembled army. This was no ordinary animal. It was a symbol of his status, his victories, his rise from escaped gladiator to commander of the greatest slave revolt in Roman history. Every man watching knew what it represented. Spartacus drew his sword and killed the horse. Plutarch records his words to the silent army. If they won this battle, he would have many fine horses to choose from among the Roman cavalry. If they lost, he would need no horse at all. It was a statement of absolute commitment, a declaration that there would be no retreat, no escape, no holding anything in reserve. He was staking his life on the outcome, and he expected every man in his army to do the same. The gesture electrified his followers. These were men who had endured slavery's degradations, fought impossible battles, and survived when the greatest military power in the ancient world had tried to destroy them. Now their leader was telling them that the end had come, and that they would face it together, on their feet, with weapons in their hands. Whatever fear they felt was transformed into something harder and more dangerous. The final battle took place near the Silarius River, in the region of Lucania. The terrain offered no particular advantage to either side, rolling countryside where armies could deploy in proper formation and fight in the open. Crassus arranged his legions in their standard battle order. Infantry in the centre, cavalry on the flanks, reserves positioned to exploit any breakthrough. His men were disciplined, well-fed, and confident. They had been waiting for this moment. Spartacus formed his army opposite the Roman lines. How many men stood with him that day remains uncertain. Estimates range from 30,000 to 50,000 fighters. They were a mixture of gladiators, former soldiers, field slaves, and household servants who had learned to fight during 2 years of brutal warfare. They were hungry, exhausted, and outnumbered, but they were not broken. The two armies faced each other across the Italian landscape. On one side stood the might of Rome, legions that had conquered kingdoms, standards that had been carried across the known world. On the other side stood slaves, Men and women who had been told they were property, who had been treated as less than human, who were supposed to be incapable of organized resistance. The battle that was about to begin would determine not just the fate of the rebellion, but the message that Rome would send to every slave in its dominions. Spartacus did not wait to receive the Roman attack. He ordered his army forward. The rebels surged across the open ground toward the Roman lines, thousands of voices screaming defiance at the masters who had enslaved them. They crashed into the wall of Roman shields with the desperate fury of men who had nothing left to lose. The fighting was savage beyond description. The gladiators at the core of Spartacus's army fought with the skill they had spent years perfecting in the arena. They knew how to kill at close quarters, how to exploit openings in an opponent's defense, how to fight even when wounded. But the Roman legions were equally skilled and far better organized. The disciplined Roman formations held against the rebel assault, shields locked, gladi stabbing forward in the efficient killing rhythm they had practiced 10,000 times. The battle became a grinding slaughter. Rebels fell by the hundreds, then by the thousands. Roman casualties mounted as well. The slaves were not dying easily. The ancient sources describe the carnage as impossible to fully count, with bodies piling up across the battlefield. Crassus's reserves moved forward to reinforce weakening sections of the line. The rebel army began to buckle under the relentless Roman pressure. In the chaos of the melee, Spartacus saw one chance, one desperate gamble that might still turn the tide. If he could reach Crassus himself, if he could kill the Roman commander, the enemy army might break. It was the logic of the arena applied to the battlefield. Kill the champion, win the fight. Spartacus gathered his personal guard and launched himself directly at the Roman command position. The gladiator cut through the Roman ranks like a blade through flesh. The ancient historians record that he killed 2 centurions who tried to stop him, veteran officers who should have been more than a match for any single opponent. Spartacus was fighting with a strength that went beyond training, beyond skill. He was fighting with the fury of a man who had spent years in chains, who had watched friends die in the arena for Roman entertainment, who had led an army of the enslaved against the greatest power on earth. But he never reached Crassus. A Roman javelin struck him in the thigh, a wound so severe that he could no longer stand. According to Appian, Spartacus went down on one knee, raised his shield and continued fighting from the ground. Roman soldiers surrounded him, stabbing and slashing. Still he fought, refusing to yield, refusing to surrender. Finally, overwhelmed by sheer numbers, the gladiator who had terrified Rome fell and did not rise again. With Spartacus dead, the rebellion died with him. The rebel army, which had held together through impossible odds as long as their leader lived, now shattered completely. Men threw down their weapons and ran. Some fled toward the mountains, hoping to lose themselves in the wilderness. Some simply stood in shock, unable to comprehend that it was finally over. And many, thousands upon thousands, were cut down where they stood by Roman swords. Crassus's legions pursued the fleeing rebels without mercy. Cavalry ran down fugitives across the Italian countryside. Infantry units swept through the nearby hills, flushing out survivors from their hiding places. The ancient sources suggest that between 5,000 and 40,000 rebels died in the battle and its aftermath. The exact number will never be known. What is certain is that the army Spartacus had built, the slave army that had humiliated Rome, ceased to exist as a fighting force. Some rebels escaped the immediate slaughter. Approximately 5,000 fled northward, perhaps hoping to cross the Alps and reach the freedom that Spartacus had once promised them. They ran directly into the path of Pompey's approaching legions. The fresh Roman army destroyed them utterly. Pompey, in his dispatch to the Senate, claimed that while Crassus had defeated the slaves in open battle, he himself had torn out the rebellion by its roots. Crassus was left with a problem: 6,000 prisoners. These were rebel slaves captured during and after the battle, men who had raised arms against their masters, who had killed Roman citizens, who had defied the natural order of the world as Rome understood it. Under Roman law, rebellious slaves faced only one punishment, and Crassus intended to make that punishment unforgettable. He ordered all 6,000 prisoners crucified along the Appian Way, Rome's most famous road, the highway that connected the capital to the southern provinces. The distance from Rome to Capua was approximately 130 miles. Do the mathematics. That meant roughly 50 crucified slaves per mile, or roughly one cross every 100 feet or so. For the entire length of Rome's greatest road, travellers would pass through an avenue of the dying and the dead. Crucifixion was Rome's most terrible form of execution. It was reserved for slaves, pirates, and the worst criminals, those whose deaths needed to be made into public spectacles. The condemned were stripped naked, their arms nailed or tied to crossbeams, then hoisted up to hang in agony. Death came slowly, sometimes over the course of days, as the victim gradually suffocated, unable to support their own weight. Crassus wanted every slave in Italy to see what happened to those who dared to rebel. Imagine travelling the Appian Way in the months that followed. The road that had symbolized Roman civilization, paved with great stones, lined with monuments and tombs, had become a highway through hell. Every 100 feet, another cross. Every 100 feet, another body. Some still alive, gasping for breath, begging for water or death. Others already corpses rotting in the Italian sun, picked at by birds and wild dogs. The bodies were left there deliberately. They were not taken down and buried. They remained on their crosses until they fell apart, until the wood rotted and collapsed, until nothing remained but bones scattered along the roadside. Travellers passing between Rome and the southern provinces had to walk through this forest of the dead for years afterward. Every merchant, every official, every slave accompanying their master, all of them saw what Rome did to those who resisted. The message was unmistakable. This is the price of rebellion. This is what happens when property forgets its place. This is the power of Rome, the absolute and terrible power that could crucify 6,000 men along a single road and leave them there as a warning for generations. The Appian Way, the road that had carried Roman civilization across Italy, had become a monument to Roman brutality. In all the slaughter and crucifixion, one body was never recovered. Spartacus himself vanished from history in the chaos of the final battle. The ancient sources, Plutarch, Appian, Florus, all agree that he died fighting, but none could confirm what happened to his remains. Perhaps he was buried under piles of the dead. Perhaps his body was so mutilated in the fighting that it could not be identified. Perhaps his followers managed to carry him away and give him a secret burial. The mystery of the missing body has haunted the story ever since. Romans desperately wanted proof that their greatest enemy was truly dead. They wanted a corpse to display, a head to mount on a spear, some tangible evidence that the nightmare was over. Instead, they got nothing. Spartacus simply disappeared, leaving behind only the legend of a slave who'd made the masters afraid. Some historians have suggested that the missing body contributed to Spartacus's enduring legend. Without proof of death, without the closure of seeing the enemy destroyed, the story remained somehow incomplete. Spartacus became not just a man who had lived and died, but a symbol that transcended his physical existence. He became the eternal rebel, the spirit of resistance that could never truly be killed. The Third Servile War was over. Rome had won. The slave system that powered the Republic's economy remained intact. Nothing fundamental had changed, or so the Romans believed, but something had shifted in the collective memory of both masters and slaves. For 2 years, escaped gladiators and field hands had defeated Roman armies, humiliated Roman commanders, and made Roman senators tremble. That could never be entirely forgotten. Spartacus became a symbol that transcended his own time. In the 18th century, French revolutionaries invoked his name as they overthrew their own aristocracy. Karl Marx called him the most splendid fellow in the whole of ancient history, a true representative of the ancient proletariat. The Spartacist League in Germany took his name during the revolutionary upheavals following World War I. Toussaint Louverture, who led the Haitian Revolution against French slavery, was compared to the Thracian gladiator. The rebellion posed fundamental questions that Rome never adequately answered. How could a society built on slavery claim to value liberty? How could a system that treated human beings as property claim to be civilized? Spartacus did not set out to answer these questions. He simply wanted to be free. But by fighting for that freedom, by proving that slaves could organize, resist, and win, he challenged assumptions that would eventually help bring down the entire institution of slavery. 2 years. 70 gladiators with kitchen knives became 120,000 warriors who brought Rome to its knees. They defeated every army sent against them until the Republic's most ruthless general was given unlimited power to destroy them. Even then, they fought until the very end. Spartacus died on his feet, sword in hand, having proven that slaves were not cattle to be managed but human beings capable of extraordinary courage and skill. The 6,000 crosses along the Appian Way stood as Rome's answer to the rebellion. But they could not crucify what Spartacus represented. They could not execute the idea that human beings deserve to be free. They could not kill the dream that the oppressed might one day rise against their oppressors. That dream lived on, carried through the centuries by everyone who heard the story of the gladiator who built an army of slaves. If this video moved you, if the story of Spartacus reminded you why history matters, then subscribe to Wars in History and join our community. We bring you the brutal truth of history's greatest conflicts, the stories that shaped our world. Hit the subscribe button, ring that notification bell, and share this video with anyone who needs to hear about the gladiator who refused to die a slave. Until next time, remember, history is not just about the past. It's about the battles we're still fighting today.